Okay, well, good morning again. Thank you so much all for joining us. My name is Intisar Fakir, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. The Eastern Mediterranean has become one of the most geopolitically contested energy regions in the world. Major gas discoveries since the early 2010s, together with shifting global alliances, unresolved boundary disputes, and post-Ukraine European demand for gas have made energy a central driver of regional conflict and of regional diplomacy. So today, in our first panel, we're going to talk about the geopolitics that are governing these molecules, from export ambition to maritime boundaries to transport routes. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of our speakers in the order that they will speak, and then we will take two rounds of questions. For our participants online, please be sure to submit your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll open it up for discussion here with everybody. So with that, let me introduce my colleague, Mirat Mabrouk. Mirat is a senior fellow here as well, Middle East Institute. We have Gabriel Mitchell on the screen with us. Gabriel is a senior policy fellow at the Mitvim Institute and a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I also have here to my right Dr. Andrew Novo, a professor of strategic studies at the National Defense University. And then last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Gunul Toll, also joining us online. She's a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. So with that, Mirat, I'd like to get started with you. Egypt is struggling to balance its hub ambition with its domestic constraints. So walk us through some of the headwinds that Egypt is facing in terms of its ambition as a regional hub, especially the rising domestic demands and the increased consumption despite the large finds of the Zohr field. With all of these constraints, does the hub ambition still remain feasible?
Right, so thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Yes, so the Zohr field, which is one of the largest fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, was found in 2015, went into production in 2017. Now, at the time, and to this date, Egypt had ambitions about being a regional gas hub. And those ambitions are well placed. Egypt has the only two liquefaction plants in the Eastern Mediterranean. So countries with large finds, like, for example, Israel and Cyprus, they still need Egypt so that they can turn their gas into LNG for export. So it all looked very promising. Now, we started to hit a bit of a dip a few years ago. Domestic demand in Egypt started to rise. It was not always possible to fill that demand. Egypt saw rolling blackouts about 3 years ago. And the Zohr field appeared to be producing less gas. So there were multiple questions on whether Egypt's role as a regional gas hub, because bear in mind that the gas hub means that Egypt is exporting that gas, even if it isn't its own gas. As a regional gas hub might, be imperiled. The truth is significantly more complicated and actually significantly more hopeful for Egypt. It isn't that there is less gas in Zohr or in the rest of the Mediterranean. It's that investment has declined in the gas production means, if you like, which Egypt is scrambling on at the moment. And they're actually quite hopeful and working hard on that. So it isn't that there's less gas, it's that there was lower investment in the production. And Egypt's domestic needs had been rising, but there is and coupled with that, actually, you had a few things. With the full Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think there was a realization in Europe of just how dependent on Russian gas Europe was, and there was a need for them to be able to expand. So Egypt as a hub looked hopeful. However, that hasn't quite come to pass. I mean, for many reasons. I mean, the Europeans eventually gas demand is going to decline because of a need to eventually phase out fossil fuels. I say eventually because this is not going to happen anytime soon. That has changed slightly, but also apart from the demand in Egypt and the declining production, Egypt imports gas from Israel, both for export and for domestic use, and Israeli gas makes up between 15 to 20% of Egypt's domestic production. And you may have heard recently about this huge gas deal that Egypt and Israel wanted to sign, about $35 billion worth. And that was, that was sort of hitting a roadblock because Israel wanted to change the terms. Now, the Israelis were faced with their own rising domestic consumption, so they wanted to make sure that they were covered, but also what they wanted to do was say, well, we will be able to deliver what we can deliver, and that's not the way these gas deals work. You are contracted to deliver a predetermined amount, otherwise you're in breach of your contract. So there was some stalling on that. I think it took some American intervention and appears to be back on plan. But again, you need to take a look at the facts. That deal isn't coming through until 2030, all right? And that lines up with Egypt's desire to up its renewables. Now, at the moment, renewables constitute almost 50% of Egypt's energy needs. There is a plan to push that up to 42% by 2030. Now, that had appeared really ambitious to me, but we had the Egyptian Minister for Petroleum and Mineral Resources here at MEI, I think it was about a week ago, and we asked him this question, and he said yes. And I have actually double checked with the Ministry of Electricity because it's not strictly his forte, and they are online to bring up renewables up to about 42% of energy use by 2030, which should free up that with the increased investment that they're working on for the energy bonds. That should free up more gas for investment. Now, the question then remains, how much demand for that gas there will continue to be? Again, this is down the road. This is not in the immediate run. There will be plenty of demand for this gas. This is not going to change anytime soon. But down the road, there are, you want to question how much gas is going to be implied, but Egypt is not going to grind to a halt on gas anytime soon. But there are also all the political complications, which we will, the regional political complications, which we can get into.
We'll talk about, yeah. Thanks, Meret. You brought up Israel, and I think, Gabriel, this is a good segue into you and sort of your perspective. Of course, Israel's energy ties with Egypt and Jordan predate the Abraham Accord, but normalization brought new opportunities for Israel until, of course, the Gaza war. So how much the recent diplomatic alignment changed the calculus for Israel? If you could step back a little bit and kind of explain Israel's positioning and motivations.
Sure. And it's great to be here, even virtually, at an event hosted by MEI. I think that, the framing here is an interesting one because if we were to think back 15, 16 years ago, when some of the more recent natural gas discoveries were found in Israel, specifically Tamar Field and Leviathan Field in 2009 and 2010, respectively, Israel was an energy island. It was not particularly well connected or integrated within the region, and it was heavily dependent on importing fossil fuels from other places around the world. And certainly the discovery of offshore hydrocarbons changed Israel's calculus. It obviously gave it abundant supply for domestic purposes, but given the relative size of the Israeli economy and its and domestic demands, it was also required by the developers to export at least some percentage of those reserves elsewhere. And so you correctly pointed out, the earliest contracts were signed with Jordan and with Egypt. I would also say as well with the Palestinian Authority through electricity contracts. And that served effectively as like a platform for Israel to engage in much broader regional engagement, even though many of the more grandiose energy pipeline deals didn't actually materialize. What's interesting about that in comparison to the Abraham Accords is that while, Israel was able to use this kind of regional connectivity momentum and bridge it with the Abraham Accords, there is not an energy component that ties Israel to, say, UAE, Bahrain, or any of the other Abraham Accord states, strictly speaking, although attempts had been made. And so I think that it's important to kind of differentiate between what took place within the realm of energy, strictly within the Eastern Mediterranean, and the promise of the Abraham Accords, which is happening in a lot of different other arenas, but in the energy space has not necessarily managed to deliver much. One exception, of course, is the decision by Mubadala to invest in Israeli offshore gas. But once again, not as an operator. The primary operator is Chevron, and I know that at some point we'll probably talk a fair bit about Chevron today. What I do want to pivot towards, because certainly, when I think about how the diplomatic arrangement of the region has changed Israel's perception of energy cooperation, is that if were to consider the years of 2009 through 2023 as years in which Israel very proactively, alongside Egypt and other actors in the Eastern Mediterranean, were very actively involved in pursuing export contracts and arrangements, establishing regional forums like the EMGF. Obviously the war has significantly dampened both investor interest in the Eastern Mediterranean and also the interest by various states to pursue cooperative arrangements and agreements. And obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the negotiations that went on between Israel and Egypt, and I imagine that we'll touch upon that in a little bit more detail. But certainly from the Israeli perspective, and with this, I'll conclude. The war, has had over securitizing effect on how the Israeli government and Israelis perceive all aspects of their life. So while the companies, the energy companies, are interested in continuing to export Israeli natural gas abroad, as they want to make a profit. And as the Israeli government also wants to endorse and pursue that, it's all now framed within a securitization umbrella of, is this to the benefit of Israel? Is Israel putting itself at risk by exporting too much of its natural gas and being overly reliant on, say, a very select number of export routes and options? So the conversation that was taking place in 2023 is different than the one that's taking place today.
Thank you, Gabriel. I want to stay maybe with the kind of security component, but look at it through a slightly different lens. So from a security perspective, Andrew, how do you assess the risk that energy competition in the Eastern Mediterranean escalates into something more kinetic, particularly given the overlapping maritime claims between Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus, where we've seen Greek and Turkish disputes over the EEZ boundaries have actually led to naval standoffs?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I've been to MEI several times as a guest, but this is my first time as a speaker. And it's good to see Gunil. I'm sorry she's remote, but I just also wanted to give a disclaimer. I do teach at the National Defense University, so nothing I say is the official policy of the National Defense University, of the Department of Defense, of the Department of War, of the United States government. So that's my disclaimer. So I want to start by taking the question of escalation and sort of separating it into two kinds of escalation. So we have kind of intentional escalation and unintentional escalation. And I think that to start with unintentional escalation, the likelihood of unintentional kinetic escalation is actually pretty low because the parties involved are very well trained. Pilots are very well trained, Navy captains are very well trained. The sense that something could become kinetic in the sense of shooting is probably very low. They have a lot of experience dealing with this, but unintentional also goes beyond kinetic into things that are more likely. And the unintentional escalation can happen in a way that's not kinetic. And you can have escalation which creates a degree of instability, a degree of fear, and that very much affects investment. Also on this point of kinetic versus non-kinetic, which gets to the intentional side of escalation, I think we do see a lot of intentional escalation, especially in the non-kinetic domain. And so as we look at security increasingly in a non-kinetic way, it's going to be important for us to assess the risks of intentional non-kinetic escalation in this region. I would also add that a lot of escalation is intended to create what people often call facts on the ground. And in this sense, the facts on the ground can be pushing someone out of a region, telling deciding, oh, we're not gonna become involved in that because we're afraid of the potential escalatory risk. You see risk being dealt with very conservatively by a lot of international companies, by a lot of energy companies. We kind of have we use the word conservative in very different ways sometimes, but big energy companies tend to be very conservative in this sense. And so the risk for them is they perceive the risk being very high. And in a sense, that's intentional escalation. I can create intentional escalation because I know that big energy companies will view the risk as too high and they will not extract molecules. And that's actually kind of the dog that doesn't bark in a sense in this story. There's been a lot of gas discoveries, especially around Cyprus. How many molecules has Cyprus extracted? I think it's 0.
Yes.
Because there is an escalation risk, and that is essentially a fact on the ground that's being created by this. You mentioned there are also, when we think of escalation, there are many different potential disputes that occur. There's Turkey and Cyprus, there's Turkey and Greece, there's Israel and Lebanon. I mean, it's not part of the challenge of the region, as I understand it. I mean, from a security side, the energy side may be a little bit different. But even from the energy side, I've heard that part of the challenge is that there needs to be more of a collective approach in order to make the gas amounts viable, in order to make the export margins viable, in order to connect gas to markets. And that collective approach is also constantly under threat because of the various dyads that are in difficult relations with each other. So I would leave it there, and we can get more into some of the political risk later.
Great, very good. Well, let's move on to Turkey, because I think maybe Turkey is one of the examples that you were talking about in sort of in terms of sort of creating a different set of facts on the ground. And Gunul, Turkey has been assertive in contesting maritime delimitation agreements underpinning Eastern Mediterranean energy development. But energy autonomy has become central to Erdogan's own domestic strategy, right? So how much of Turkey's posture in the Eastern Mediterranean is actually driven by genuine energy interests versus domestic political calculations for Erdogan?
Hi, good morning, everyone. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm fighting this terrible cold. Yes, both, Intisar. I think I mean, obviously, for a country like Turkey that is a huge energy consumer, but also poor in hydrocarbon resources, becoming an energy autonomous is not realistic. But Turkey has been trying to become less vulnerable. And that is very much part of Erdogan's domestic strategy. Right now, it's energy dependent on countries like Russia, like Iran, Iraq, and that really makes Turkey quite vulnerable, puts it in a very difficult spot. So, and in this world, this fracturing world where there is increasing uncertainty, um, becoming strategically autonomous has become an important component of these middle powers strategies, right? So energy, from Turkey's point of view, decreasing its energy vulnerability is part of that strategy. And he has been trying to do this for some time now. Erdogan is trying to turn Turkey into an energy hub where energy resources are not just transited, but also bought and sold by outside parties. And the thinking is that would create mutual interdependencies with both Western countries and regional countries, and also boost Turkey's power. So that's been the strategy for more than 10-15 years, but Turkey's foreign policy kind of got in the way of achieving that goal. For example, Iraq, right? Iraq is one of Turkey's top oil suppliers, but Turkey's relationship really strained ties with Iraq, and that prevented Ankara from achieving that goal. In 2013, for example, Turkey started facilitating oil exports from Iraq's Kurdistan regional government, and that was in violation of an agreement, a 1973 agreement between Turkey and Iraq. It was a pipeline agreement, and relations were already strained over Turkey's cross-border operations into Iraq against the PKK, and there were problems around water sharing. So the relations were not in a good place already, but this oil dispute made things worse. And a year later, in 2014, Iraq filed for arbitration with the ICC, and the ICC ruled in Iraq's favor. And in response, Turkey just stopped oil imports from Iraq. So that's just one example of how Turkey's regional policies really complicated this ambition of turning the country into an energy hub. Also in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's foreign policy missteps, particularly following the Arab uprisings, really complicated things. For instance, with Egypt, right? Egypt is a big player in the Eastern Mediterranean, and because of Turkey's support for Muslim Brotherhood linked groups, that relationship became really complicated. And then Turkey's intervention into Syria and also Libya made things worse. Particularly this maritime border agreements that Turkey had signed with Tripoli-based government in Libya. It really alarmed Greece, Cyprus, and also Egypt. So you see, because of all these policies, you see the emergence of this anti-Turkey coalition in the East Med that included Greece, Cyprus, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and at times France. So I think the lesson learned from that experience was that Turkey really needed to collaborate with these regional countries. And right now, and since 2019, I should say, Turkey has been taking steps to mend ties with these countries, but it sees the current geopolitical context as a great opportunity to build on those steps. for example, the toppling of Syria. Now there's a new chapter there, and Turkey just last December, Turkish officials were talking about signing an easy agreement with the new rulers in Syria, for example. And Turkey has been trying to do that for many years now, but it was always opposed by Syria and also Russians, right? So right now, Turkey looks at the region and sees Russia is in a weakened position. So is Iran, and then there are new dynamics in Syria. Turkey's relationship with Iraq has also improved. So put all those things together, and Erdogan thinks that this is a perfect moment to build on that momentum. So that's where Turkey stands, but I think there are also serious challenges.
Thanks, Gönül. I want to talk about the gas forum, the Eastern Med Gas Forum. Meret, the gas forum is a real diplomatic achievement for Egypt, but of course, as Gönül was talking about, Turkey's exclusion remains a structural problem. So especially since Cairo tries to improve ties with Ankara, but also maintaining a good relationship with Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. Do you see the gas forum as ultimately reinforcing the fault lines in the region rather than resolving them? And let me also ask you about another thing that had come up, which is the Palestinian dimension. You know, the Gaza maritime field has been sitting there since 2000 due to Israeli restrictions awaiting development. How does that factor into the broader picture that we are talking about?
Okay, so those are all really interesting. I'm going to pick up where Gönül left off. So the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum was set up in 2019. It was kicked off by Egypt, but then Egypt and then Israel. And it has, it's Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Greece, Cyprus, Italy, and a few years ago, France sneaked in round the back. All right, it used its total investments of the cards. And I think it's odd that it's in there, but you know, the more the merrier. But that list has a super notable exclusion, and that is Turkey. All right. Now, there have been criticisms of the EMGF that, you know, rather than it being a neutral entity that helps regional players sort out their political differences, it's really it's a strategic organization for countries with shared economic interests. It wasn't set up as a political diplomatic entity. It was set up exactly as an organization for countries with shared regional interests. However, it has been working on the diplomatic front. The inclusion of Palestine was a very, very big deal. Egypt had to fight for that. And I mean, the Israelis had problems with security. They have been going back and forth on it for almost the 7 years. And the really tragic thing is the Israelis had given permission, and that came through in September 2023, right before October 7th. And it's obviously ground to a halt since then. God knows what's going to happen. Now, the fact that it is an organization set up for other countries with shared economic interest does not mean that it is outside the diplomatic realm. In fact, it has to be, because as we've been saying, this entire area is a massively energetic, diplomatic, swirling drain. And alliances shift, all right? Now, Egypt certainly was not involved in excluding Turkey when EMGF was set up. I think it was just a nice bonus for Egypt that Turkey was included. But the biggest problems were Greece and Cyprus, particularly Cyprus. And you know, Cyprus was the one with all the energy fines, so there was no discussion of which way lean. Having said that, as Gönül pointed out, Turkey has been singing a different tune. Turkey is interested in greater regional cooperation. And I think everybody, possibly with the exception of the Greeks and the Cypriots, who still have very serious concerns, are interested in greater regional cooperation, but also, and this is specifically for the Egyptians, they are interested in stability. Because, as Andrew was pointed out, there is potential for things to get messy. Whether accidentally or not accidentally, it is always a potential, and nobody wants that. Certainly not Egypt, which already has 3 conflicts on 3 different borders that it really isn't involved. All right. So when EMGF was set up, there was all this talk about gas diplomacy and how, I mean, the assumption was the money would ensure that people got their acts together and were all chummy. It doesn't work like that. Policy does not work like that. I mean, countries do not work like that, because very often your economics is not driven by best policy ideas. It is driven by other considerations. Consistently, we have had governments, I mean, we're talking about this region, but in any region, I'm sure that we can all point at policies that we know are not a good idea economically, but have been, yes, but have been forced through because they have political heft. So gas diplomacy is never going to achieve its full potential simply because countries are countries. But having said that, I do think that there is a movement to attempt to further consolidate these energies, because really all of these countries need each other. Cyprus has huge fines, but nobody is, going to invest if they, think that there's a likelihood that their investment is going to go down the drain. And Cyprus isn't going to be able to move this stuff without the aid of other countries. So there is going to have to be a concerted effort to try and move things along. And I think certainly I can see it with Turkey. I know the Egyptians are moving on trying to include Turkey. But then, of course, Israel, Greece, Cyprus all have issues. But again, as Gönül pointed out, Ankara is showing a renewed pragmatism, so I remain hopeful.
Great, thanks, Meret. Gabrielle, I'll come to you on this question of limits of, sort of potential for energy cooperation. There's been, of course, friction between Israel and Egypt, as Meret talked about in her first answer, with Israel wanting reportedly to condition supply on its own domestic needs, which is, I think Meret mentioned, is not generally standard in these kinds of setups. So what does this tension tell us about the limits of energy cooperation, even between partners that have every reason and every an incentive to cooperate?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think that, if I was to just kind of comment on one thing that Meret pointed out, there is this gap between the private sector and between state actors, specifically in the Eastern Mediterranean, but we could apply this to other regions as well, where each party is looking for the other to take the lead. And as a result, nobody takes the lead. Certainly within the context of Israel's energy relationship with Egypt, which is incredibly robust and actually predates the discovery of offshore natural gas. Egypt was a key supplier of both oil and natural gas to Israel prior to the Arab Spring, and it's a core pillar of the relationship between the two countries. I think that Israel's reservations were at least in some small doses due to some of the challenges that were associated with the war and the gap between the Netanyahu government and the Sisi government about Israel's conduct during the war, whether it be related to refugees from Gaza, the humanitarian situation, but also, of course, far-right elements within Israel that were trying to identify any kind of bogeyman to kind of stir up national fervor. And for a brief period of time, Egypt was definitely one of those neighboring countries. And I think that that very much influenced, in a negative sense, the dynamic between Jerusalem and Cairo and the ability for both parties to move things forward. Certainly, from the perspective of the investors in the private sector, investment to expand exports from Israel to Egypt had already been in the works prior to the beginning of the war. And the government very much wanted to play along with the private sector. There were, of course, hesitations that weren't related to anything associated with the war, but were related to domestic concerns within Israel, because just the same way that Egypt has increasing demand both for natural gas, but specifically for electricity, Israeli domestic demand is also increasing, both due to structural changes that Israel has made to be more reliant on domestic natural gas reserves. Natural gas, supplies 70% of Israel's electricity needs, 40% of its national energy needs. And of course, that demand is increasing and will increase in the future as Israel invests specifically in AI data centers as it builds out its tech industry. So there are concerns that are totally not related to the contract with Egypt, but the contract with Egypt raised for the first time in several years these worries within Israel about the end of peak gas, and that a contract of that size would inevitably impact both the longevity of Israel's natural gas reserves, but also natural gas prices. Israel's electricity prices are amongst the lowest in the region, and certainly when you compare that to the European Union, quite low. But that could change, especially because of another structural challenge that Israel faces, which is that Chevron, who's the primary operator of Israel's two gas fields and is the primary supplier of its domestic natural gas, is also the primary investor in the export of that same gas abroad. And when you have the same company that is delivering your gas and exporting it abroad, you can very quickly reach a scenario in which the prices start to accelerate and get out of control. So it isn't necessarily about the bilateral relationship exclusively, but there are concerns long term for Israel, certainly in the wake of October 7th, of maintaining its energy security bottom line and how best to do it, whether it's diversifying its export options or conversely contracting and exporting less. It doesn't want to find itself in a situation which it negates or reneges on its contracts, but it also wants to position itself in a way that can ensure long-term security and economic stability over the next 15 to 20 years.
Thanks, Gabriel. Andrew, I want to shift to ask you about NATO and the tensions inside NATO, the struggles essentially to manage the Greece-Turkey tensions internally. And I was curious, to what extent do you see the alliance's inability to manage these internal tensions impacting broader Western interests in Eastern Mediterranean energy security?
So I would start by saying that internal tensions are nothing new to NATO. There's always some problem going on somewhere. It's a problem between Germany and France, between France and the United States, 1966, between Greece and Turkey, between Turkey and Germany. It's always a very dynamic. I think Miret described alliances are dynamic, and so yeah, this is a very, in a way, we're very comforted by NATO. It's been there forever. It has all these institutions around it. It's more than just one treaty. It's also a whole structure of institutions. But it is an organization that it's used to disruption and challenges and contention among its members. I would start that, well, I continue that by saying that what we're seeing now in NATO, in a way, is actually a challenge to one of its founding three pillars. So the old British logic of NATO was, remember, everyone knows, right? Russians out, Americans in, Germans down. And ironically, because we don't usually think of this as one of the primary features of NATO, the pillar which is actually most under challenge of that one, you could argue, is the Germans down one. And that's actually something that's been going on for a little bit. I can put you back to 2011. The Polish foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, said, "I fear German power less than I'm beginning to fear German inactivity." And that was in 2011. And granted, he was speaking in the context of the huge euro crisis, the financial crisis, whether Greece was going to be kicked out of the euro, and the massive financial crisis of 2011. But he still said, hey, I'm probably the first Polish foreign minister in history to say this, that I fear German inactivity more than I fear German power. And so that's actually a primary element of the NATO relationship that is going to be negotiated and we're going to struggle with over the next 5 years, is how active Germany, I hope that's not from the US government for me, how active the Germany's presence will be in NATO as a security organization, as an organization guaranteeing security based on NATO's principles of what it's there to defend. And I can actually transition from that point to your question specifically about Greece and Turkey and energy, because for countries like Greece, the protection against escalation by a country like Turkey, and Mira mentioned France's entry into the Eastern Gas Forum, is not NATO. It's the European Union. And protection from the European Union means protection from the big boys in the European Union, which means Germany at some point, but for now, France. And so what we see is a very interesting relationship developing between Greece and France, in addition to NATO, where they are looking for bilateral defense relationship, cooperation, new defense agreement. And on one level, it seems kind of strange. Wait a minute. You're allies in NATO, you've been that way for decades. Your allies in the European Union, you've been that way for decades. You feel the need as governments that you want additional defense agreements, additional commitments, additional structures and frameworks. And so there's an element of that. So what we're seeing is how active Germany will be in NATO, and then how NATO will function in coordination with sort of bespoke agreements among NATO nations and European nations at the same time. How this goes to the West's interests in the region when it comes to energy, Gabriel raised an excellent point about technology and AI and how this is just going to continue to increase the demand for energy. And that's, in a sense, that's new, right? I mean, think about how, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, everyone was excited. We all bought like energy efficient appliances. We were thinking about how we could reduce our energy usage, right? Or at least level it out. The population would continue to grow, but energy usage would somehow stabilize. And then all of a sudden, wow, boom, everything exploded. First, we needed cloud computing and data centers because we all take 47,000 pictures of our cats and we keep them forever. And so there are massive data farms somewhere that have pictures of your cat. And unless you delete it and ask them to delete it like 47 times and take it off the iCloud backup, the pictures of your cat are there forever. And that's running a lot of energy. You may love your cat enough to do that, but maybe, also think of the environment. But so there's that. And now, of course, not on the trivial side, things like artificial intelligence, this just requires huge amounts of energy, which is also driving energy prices up. You can chart this. I've charted this a couple of times for a class that I teach with Gunil's husband on the Eastern Mediterranean. We put a chart for the students of like energy prices like this, computing through AI like that. They're the same. Now, whether that's correlation or causation. You know, I was always taught you have to be careful about disentangling these things, but this is a relevant thing. The energy usage is increasing, the energy prices are increasing. That's good for Eastern Mediterranean gas because it means that there is a margin there for them to make money. And so in terms of interests, what we've heard are you could basically do 4 or 5 big interests. Interest number one for the West is get off Russian gas. This is, the Americans have said this, the Germans have said this, most European countries have said this. It's been a battle in the European Union because obviously, as we know, some countries have been more reluctant to move away for whatever reason. We can talk about that at a different time. Point two is away from Russian gas and toward, at least from an American perspective, toward American gas. The United States, especially in recent years, has been, yeah, great, get off Russian gas, and we have a ready-made alternative for you. It's American gas. It comes across the ocean. Poland is a massive importer of American natural gas. Turkey is a massive importer of American natural gas. Italy is a massive importer of American natural gas now. And that's not by accident. Another interest, which we see clearly from an Eastern Mediterranean perspective, is multiple pipelines. I had a wonderful friend who sadly passed away, who was an expert in the energy industry, and he used to say, for the energy industry, happiness is multiple pipelines, right? And so happiness is multiple pipelines. You have gas that can connect Egypt, great. You have gas that can connect Israel, great. You have gas that can connect Cyprus, great. Multiple pipelines makes for happiness. You have Azeri gas, happiness is multiple pipelines. There is also, and I think Miret mentioned this, the idea of, and Gunil as well, gas hubs, right? So there is a Western interest in creating gas hubs, and every country wants to be a gas hub, right? We talked about Turkey wants to be a gas hub. Greece definitely wants to be a gas hub. Greece wants to utilize the facilities in Alexandroupoli to create LNG terminals, to have access points for American natural gas there, and then to distribute it to Europe through something called the vertical gas corridor. Italy wants to be a major gas hub. It wants to link up into the European grid. It wants to use gas from North Africa to do that, from Libya, from Algeria, from Tunisia, from wherever they can get it. That's why the Meloni government has been very active in its interactions with countries in North Africa. I don't have to tell you guys that at MEI, right? But it's been extremely active in doing that. And the last, sorry, I said 4, maybe 5, is depending on the political climate, there is a kind of all of the above approach to energy, right? We're not going to the sort of measured Belgium, measured Brussels European bureaucratic language of, well, the green energy transition, that may be too ambitious. They'll say it even more diplomatically than that. But there's going to be an all of the above approach. We need natural gas. We need to keep going and pushing ahead with our renewables strategy, but we also need to reinvigorate our nuclear programs. You see Italy pushing forward with nuclear energy, Germany thinking about nuclear energy, Turkey thinking about nuclear energy, pushing ahead with Akkuyu. So there's an all of the above approach to that. And so I think Western interests will break down that way when it comes to energy.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. Great stuff. Gunul, you've already touched a little bit on the kind of tensions surrounding Turkey and the anti-Turkey alignment among Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. And I was curious if you can talk a little bit more about how does that play out for Turkey's broader ambition in the region? Is there any realistic path forward towards Turkey's inclusion in the Eastern Mediterranean energy framework?
I mean, that's certainly what Erdogan is pushing for, right? Just recently, I spoke with Greek officials, and this was before Greek Prime Minister's visit to Ankara, and they were telling me that Erdogan really wants this tension to go away, and is ready to take steps, but it's a very challenging place. I mean, with regards to, for example, Israel, I mean, you have that really complicating things for Turkey. I mean, Israel's recent Eastern Med posture, right? It's tighter defense cooperation with Greece and Cyprus, and then you have all these infrastructure and connectivity projects. There's a deeper security footprint around Cyprus. So all those things really makes Turkey's position more complicated by internationalizing these disputes that Ankara once tried to manage bilaterally. So it is part of that equation, so that Israel, for example, what Israel is doing in the East Med and its relationship with Greece and Cyprus, you see this emergence of a strong front. That security alignment between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus is getting more operational. They have moved from political signaling to planning more joint naval and air exercises this year in 2026. And they're implementing this trilateral defense action plan. And it really, from Turkey's point of view, it really raises the military and diplomatic costs for Turkey to use this gray zone naval pressure around contested waters. And it also strengthens Greece's hand in the Aegean and in East Med, bargaining by pairing these maritime disputes with a broader security partnership. And you also have these maritime boundary diplomacy around Cyprus that keeps moving. But that's not the only problem either. You have Turkey's problematic relationship with Greece and Cyprus. And you also have some European governments, right? It's true that invasion of Ukraine really opened this debate and provided Turkey an opportunity. As European countries are trying to decrease the energy dependence on Russia, they're looking for alternative ways. So Turkey's role popped up. Now there's this debate around that, but European countries are also very polarized on that question, because many of them, they don't want to depend on Turkey for energy. And I would say another wild card for Turkey is President Trump's Iran and Russia policies. We don't know what will happen there. When Joe Biden, for example, when he imposed sanctions on Russia's Gazprom, Turkey received exemptions. And Trump reintroduced those sanctions against Iranian oil exports in 2018, and he also gave Turkey exemptions. So moving forward, we don't know what will happen in that space. I mean, Trump said that, he wants to drive Iran's oil exports to zero. And we don't know whether he will be willing to give Turkey, if that happens, give Turkey exemptions. And then you have the Syria angle too. This new Syria does play a very important role in what Turkey wants to do on the energy front. They want to build these new pipelines, want to sign these EEZ agreements, and there seems to be some movement on that. But it is still, I mean, from Syria's point of view, it also wants to cultivate closer ties with these regional countries. So it's not a straightforward decision for Ahmed al-Shara to sign this agreement with Turkey. It's trying to juggle several things, and it's trying not to alienate other countries. And finally, there is Iraq. I mean, with Prime Minister Soudani, Turkey has made significant progress in resolving many of the disputes there. There's been a water sharing agreement, and they're moving forward on the PKK. Last year, Iraq designated it as a banned organization. and between KRG and Baghdad, there seems to be a middle ground now that the parties are willing to agree on. So those are all great things, but Iraq will hold elections this year. And just recently, last week, there was Iraqi officials protested what the Turkish foreign minister had said about the PKK present in Iraq. So that the balance there is really delicate. And now Nouri al-Maliki is this Shia coalition's candidate. And if he becomes the prime minister, that's really not good news. And also complicating things, what will happen to Turkey's own talks with the PKK, because if those talks fail, then Turkey's relationship, these man ties with Iraq, could get really complicated. That will have a huge impact on Turkey's energy cooperation with Iraq. So, I mean, understandably, Turkish officials looked at this new geopolitical power dynamics in the region and see this as a great opportunity. But still, many challenges remain, I think.
Great, thanks, Gönül. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for audience questions, and we'll take a couple of questions from around the room. We also have a couple of questions online. So if there are any questions, yes, please. Just briefly introduce yourself first, please, and then ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for doing this. Very informative. My name is Valentina Pasquali. I'm a senior editor here in Washington with AGBI, Arabian Gulf Business Insight. We're a news website that covers business in the MENA region primarily, with a focus on the Gulf. You guys have mentioned Mubadala Energy at the very beginning. I was wondering if you could articulate, and it's not for anyone in particular, in fact, I'd be curious about different perspective on this, the role of Gulf investments in the Eastern Mediterranean gas industry. When the Secretary of EMGF was here just a couple of weeks ago, he explicitly said he wants to attract more of that. There are obviously different players with different agendas in the Gulf. Qatar has obviously its large interest in its own gas, but is already invested in the Eastern Mediterranean. UAE is looking and entering it. Has the Gulf the ability, willingness to become something of an anchor for more investment in the Eastern Mediterranean? Is it a pipe dream?
Thank you. Meret, why don't you start addressing the point about Gulf investment, and then I'll go to Gabriel and then Gönül, and we'll come to you, Andrew.
Okay. So, not my area of expertise. I will say specifically about the Qataris. I know that the Qataris are very interested, and I found it interesting that the Qataris were interested because, as you said, they have huge gas deposits. But I do think that the area has become really interesting to investors. And I think not just because of the gas involved, but because of the political and diplomatic leverage that it offers. All right. I mean, obviously companies want to make money. That's what they do. They have shareholders. But I also think that in the region, politics plays an outsized role. And I think that investment in the region is going to be carefully calibrated. I don't want to go into more detail on that because I'm not the best person to talk about it, but that's what that's what I've been following. I do think that interest is very carefully calibrated, and it has a lot to do with how alliances in the region are shifting.
Great. Gabriel, your perspective on Gulf investment?
Yeah, I very much agree with that perspective. The only other thing that I would add here is that when we think about Gulf investment, are we thinking about Gulf investment as suppliers of energy to Eastern Mediterranean states or as investors in Eastern Mediterranean energy projects? And I think that the answer to that question obviously will lead to different types of perspectives about how the Gulf states could potentially play a role. The second thing that I would add, and I think that this is important to remember, we haven't spoken about it yet, but the conversation, let's say prior to October 7th is very different than the one today, where both regional and international actors are leaning on Gulf investment for a wide variety of different types of initiatives, notably and chiefly the potential for Gulf investment in the reconstruction of Gaza, right? And so while Gulf pockets are very, 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 very deep, at some point somebody needs to make a decision, where am I going to get the best return on my investment? And the Eastern Mediterranean, at least over the last 15 years, has proven to be a mixed bag because of the politics of the region and because of some of the risks involved. I would say, just as a final point, that just weeks before October 7th, some Gulf countries, obviously European and Indian countries, all got together and they proposed the IMEC, right, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, to which a lot of that Gulf investment was also presumed to be involved, and maybe even potentially Gulf energy as well. All of these things are on hold, not exclusively because of the Eastern Mediterranean's own unique dysfunction, but there are a lot of issues that remain unresolved. The ceasefire in Gaza is only months old, and I think that some of the politics needs to be arranged and ironed out. Can that happen through potential Gulf investment or the engagement of Gulf states in regional diplomacy? Absolutely. I'm not sure that it's happened quite yet.
Okay, Gunul? Do you want to weigh in on the Gulf question? Okay, Andrew, do you want to weigh in on the Gulf investment question before we move on to others?
I think I wanted to.
Murat?
It was
Before-
just a
Follow up,
tiny,
Sure.
it was just a tiny little thing. I think or at least I have mostly been talking about gas, but you also want to bear in mind that when we were discussing investing for diplomatic reasons and essentially extending your geopolitical influence, a lot of these investments are also in renewable energy. So it goes beyond the gas. It's not, and the renewable energy, I think, is less constrained by the same constraints that constrain the gas, because then you can invest in the country rather than having the rights to produce that gas.
Right.
So
we'll take a couple more questions over there.
Yes, Ted Katouf, former U.S. ambassador to Syria, the UAE. I know they're small players, but in terms of their potential to disrupt things, the offshore gas in Lebanon, now that there's been a boundary line agreed to, and the gas offshore of Gaza that I believe Israel covets, along with Gaza itself. What do you have to say about future events in terms of developing the Lebanese gas fields, and also how far is Israel likely to go in trying to either undercover or overtly, develop the Gaza gas fields?
Great. Actually, Gabriel, before I come to you on that, I have a couple of related questions online as well. So one on the implications of Israel-Lebanon war and dispute over the Karish and Kana oil field. So we'll add that to the ambassador's question. And then again, the primary motivation for Israel and I guess interest in Gaza, is it simply to take over Gaza for offshore gas reserves? I'm having a hard time reading the handwriting here, but these are basically the two questions that I would like to add to the last one, and we'll come to you for your answer.
Sure. Well, briefly, I know that a couple of weeks ago, French supermajor Total announced that it was going to start exploring in Block 8, which is on the Lebanese side of the maritime delimitation border between Israel and Lebanon. So I think that that's a pretty clear sign that it's going to be, at the very least, business as usual, provided that there's a continued, low range, risk for investors in that space. So I don't anticipate, nor have I seen any indication that the war that took place between Israel and Hezbollah had any kind of undue effect on the future of exploration in Lebanon's waters. And as it relates to Gaza, I think it's important to keep everything into perspective. In terms of, Gaza Marine Field, which obviously has been plagued by the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and not been developed, we're talking about a field with an estimated 32 BCM, which is a small size field. I would be the first person to say it should be developed, and I think it's very possible that in some constellation of interests in the restoration and reconstruction of Gaza, the field does end up being developed because, as Miret pointed out, there was interest and a consensus of a mechanism to develop that field prior to the start of the war. But in terms of other fields, it's really unclear as to whether there's anything else out there, and I do not think that it was a motivating factor in Israel's set of interests when it engaged in the war.
Okay, great. Anybody else wants to weigh in on the Israel and Lebanon aspect? So then I will take a couple more questions here. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Mohammed Hassan from Summer Egypt, IVLT Allen. I've been selected one of top 50 influencers in the Middle East talking about politics. Actually, I need to ask about the future of the Egyptian-Israeli gas deal. From your personal point of view, is this deal really have a future? All the political decisions in the futures and the events in the Middle East and the tension in the Middle East could play role in affecting this deal. Second of all, I need to ask about the future of Egyptian dream about being a gas hub. Is it really gonna be that? I mean, what I can see is that Egypt is affected by Turkey. Is it could be play a role in affecting the deals with Israel and Cyprus or not? This is my question, actually.
Thank you. All right, why don't you take that and we'll do another round of questions after.
Sure. Okay. So as far as the Egypt-Israel gas deal, to the best of my knowledge, yes, that's going to go forward. Now, again, it is going to kick in 2030. This is not immediate. It's going to kick in 2030. Now, as we were saying, you cannot separate the politics from the economy. As far as the economy is concerned, it's a good deal for everybody. It should move forward. However, there is absolutely no doubt that the conflict in Gaza has made this deal very difficult for both parties, particularly for the Egyptians, because of the perceived optics. All right. Having said that, I think the government will move forward with doing what it considers best for the economy and is just going to and go ahead and do it anyway. So to the best of my knowledge, yes, that deal is going to go through. Makes sense for everyone. It will go through. Now, the future of Egypt as a hub, I'm sorry, you said Egypt is influenced by Turkey. I'm sorry, in what way? But I'm so sorry?
I mean, being allied with Turkey, could it affect the deals with
I see. All right, so Egypt is not aligned with Turkey. In fact, it's only recently that we have been looking at some sort of rapprochement, and it's only recently that relations have started warming. I mean, if you remember, 3 years ago, there's a very, very, very different topography. And whereas relations are significantly warmer now, I probably wouldn't characterize them as anything more than cooperative and polite. Egypt is certainly not going to be, in my estimation, is certainly not going to be taking any decisions that concern its economy and its security based upon what any country thinks, as a bit, not just Turkey. Egypt tends to maintain a, quite surprisingly, always independent foreign policy. That doesn't always make life easier for it, but it is super focused on its own security and stability, and is not about to be shoved off its little X on the spot by what other countries are thinking. I know there are often questions when there are political or economic relationships. I get that question all the time with Egypt and the Gulf. Well, I mean, doesn't Egypt have to do what the Gulf said? No, it doesn't. If it had, life would be, I think, a lot easier for Egypt. But so the answer to that is no, it's not going to be influenced by Turkey. The questions as to the viability of Egypt being a gas hub are directly related to actually what we've been talking about, which is the viability of gas going forward and competition in the region. I think it is in an excellent spot because, as we said, it has the only 2 liquefaction plants in the Eastern Mediterranean. Those are enormous investments. So yes, I think it's in a good place to do so. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Murat. Anybody, Gönül, do you want to weigh in on this?
No, but Intisar, I don't know if you can see them. There are 2 questions online about Turkey. One is whether Qatar is relevant to Turkey's plans to build this pipeline through Syria. And there's another question about nuclear energy. Well, Qatar is very much relevant. As I said, Ankara wants to build this new oil and gas pipeline linking Syria to Turkey's export terminals. And I think the new thinking in Ankara is that with Assad gone, now those long frozen pipeline project that connects Turkey and Qatar via Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria, they want to revitalize that. So Qatar is an important component of that, and it is Turkey's closest ally in the Gulf, and it's one of the Qatar is one of the few Gulf states that could realistically finance infrastructure and provide long-term gas supply contracts. So that relationship is important, but whether Turkey will be able to realize that is another question. And the second question about Turkey online is whether about, let me see, Turkey's nuclear ambitions and which countries it's working with, and whether relying on Russia is a concern. Well, Russia is building Turkey's first nuclear reactor in southern Turkey, but actually the model itself is really interesting that we don't see very often in the nuclear field, and that is Russia is building a nuclear reactor on Turkish soil, but it's owned and will be operated by Russia. So that does create a significant vulnerability. But developing nuclear energy is part of Turkey's energy policy. And Russia is not the only country that Turkey is seeking partnership with. There are 2 other spots where Turkey wants to build nuclear power plants, but it's talking with other countries too, including South Korea, for example, is one of them. It was late 2025. Turkish nuclear energy company and the Korean company, they signed a cooperation agreement on nuclear technology. So that's one. And United States also, Turkey is exploring with American firms and technology for future nuclear plants. And China and Canada are also other countries. So Russia is not the only country that Turkey is planning to partner with on nuclear energy.
Great, thank you, Gönül. Any other questions in the room? So maybe I ask our speakers if they have any concluding thoughts that they want to share, or just maybe we'll do a quick round if there's any concluding thoughts. Otherwise, we will go ahead and take our lunch break. So we'll have about a half hour before the next session starts, and lunch will be brought in here. So please feel free to enjoy lunch and some drinks, and then we'll resume again with our next panel at 12. Let me thank our speakers. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
guess that you'll call
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
Hi, Colby. Do you mind turning your Hi, do you mind turning your mic on? Yeah, I'll just do a sound check
Yeah,
as
sure.
well.
Can you
Great,
hear me
thank you
okay?
very much. Yeah, that's great. Perfect.
Great.
And Lori, could you do the same sound check as well?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. There's a bit of an echo, but I think it's okay.
Okay.
How's that for you? Do you mind just saying
Yes.
good afternoon?
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for having me finally as a speaker on at the Institute.
We're really glad to have you with us today. I think
Thank
it'll be
you.
interesting. Good. Yeah. Okay, your sound is all good as well. Great. Thank you.
Perfect. Perfect.
Oh, perfect. Hi, good afternoon.
Hello. Hi.
Hi. Okay, perfect. Your sound is good too. Could you just say good afternoon for me as well, Anne Sophie?
Good afternoon. How are
Okay,
you?
perfect. Great. Okay. So just a few minor details. I'll be online the entire time. We are live right now with our audience. Our audience in person can't hear you, but our audience online can. My camera and microphone will be turned off throughout the conference. I will let you know when we're going to go live. You will be able to see the stage again when the panelists, Dr. Karen Young and the audience in person can see you. So that will show up on your computer, but I'll also let you know. And then Karen will indicate that the webinar will be starting again. That will be in the next 5 or so minutes. We might start briefly later to let some people filter into the room as audience people coming. Okay. One last brief note for all of the panelists. We will be doing Q&A in the Q&A chat box. Dr. Karen Young will be managing it from her computer, so no need to look at the Q&A chat box at all. She'll be filtering through questions as they come in.
think I'm on, right? Yeah, you're on. Okay. And we can start whenever, or give it a minute? Okay, everyone, I think we will reconvene for our second panel. If you'll take your seats, please. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online, and hope you enjoyed a lunch break at home or wherever you are, morning, afternoon, evening. We've got a fantastic second panel, and I think, please take your seat, sir. Yeah, take your seat. You, hi, thanks. So I think it's important that we do this session because there were a lot of empirical questions that came up in session one, which was more around the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean and sort of prospects and challenges for energy development. And you've got a fantastic panel of experts for the second session to really give you, I think, some more granular details and facts about the realities on the ground. The second session is titled The Gas Supply Outlook, East Med Production, Regional Deliveries, and New Investment Opportunities. So specifically that question on Gulf investment in the region, we will get to that. And so Valentina, you'll have some good information there. My name is Karen Young. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Economics and Energy Initiative here at the Middle East Institute. I'm also a senior research scholar at Columbia University in the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I've got four excellent panelists to talk to you today. We have Anne-Sophie Corbeau, who is a global research scholar, also at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Ira Joseph, who is also at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia, senior research associate. Laurie Haitayan, who's director for Middle East and North Africa at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. And Colby Connolly, who works with me here at MEI as a senior fellow and in his full-time role is head of Middle East content for energy intelligence and is joining us from Dubai. So we've got Paris, Dubai. Laurie, I don't know, where are you today?
Hello, yes, so hello from Brussels.
From Brussels, and Ira from New York. Okay, this is good. So around the world there. So same kind of session as the first, only I'm up here alone, so anyone wants to come join me, you're welcome. We'll have the panelists give remarks with specific kind of prompts for, I don't know, 5, 7, up to 10 minutes, see how long they go. I might interrupt them. We'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion from our online participants, from anyone here in the room. If you're in the room, raise your hand. Someone will come to you with a mic, introduce yourself, ask your question. Same thing for online, except use the Q&A function. And I've got a computer up here with me so I can read out the questions and be sure that we get to as many as we can. What else should I say? I mean, I think, you know, a lot of the politics around the Eastern Mediterranean gas basin and what's possible or not possible has a lot to do with the global market. And so we're going to start the conversation just getting you some facts, some real understanding. I want to go to Anne-Sophie first. So Anne-Sophie, if you would tell us a little bit about this global supply glut or plentiful supply. There's some questions around, you know, certainly the EU demand outlook, how that's changed, and that came up in the first session, certainly since 2022. And you know, something more broad that I think or was a discussion point in the first session was why we see an increase of demand for all kinds of energy. And one of the speakers attributed it to AI, but that's not really the whole story. It's really about electrification writ large across our economies and growing economies in particular. So Anne-Sophie will probably give us a little bit of a picture of that. And I hope Anne-Sophie as well talk to us about the reliability of US supply. I think that's been a concern in Europe. That's probably something you're hearing from your counterparts. And other reliable suppliers from within the region. So in the western side of the Med, Algeria has been a really important source of gas to Europe in the last few years. So give us a little bit of an understanding of that global picture, what the demand outlook looks like, where new supply is coming online, and what that means for the potential for the East Med region in particular. So go ahead, Anne-Sophie.
Thank you very much, Karen, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank MI for inviting me. In terms of the global gas market, I mean, we're still in a relatively tight situation because gas prices in Europe right now are at about 30 euro per megawatt hour, so it's a little bit more than $10 per MMBTU. This is higher than what we used to have before the crisis. Before the crisis, it was about 15 to 20 euro per megawatt hour. So we are still in a relatively tight situation. And in Europe right now, I mean, the main topic of conversation is the fact that we have relatively low storage. But there is a big wave of LNG which is coming. It has already started to come. Last year, we had already about 60 BCM per year of LNG export capacity coming to the market, mostly coming from the United States, but also from Canada. And there is another more than 300 billion cubic meter of LNG export capacity coming up to the beginning of the 2030s. So to give you an idea, the global LNG market last year was about 600 billion cubic meter, and EU gas demand is about 340 billion cubic meters. So that gives you an idea. So this is where we are now, and we are all waiting for this wave of LNG supply to come to the market because we do expect that this is going to have a downward impact on gas prices. So if I want to give a little bit of highlight on the importance of EastMed in that, something quite important which has happened over the past 3-4 years has been happening in Egypt. We have already heard that during the first panel, but in 2022, Egypt was still a relatively sizable LNG exporter. They exported about 9 billion cubic meters, which was actually quite welcome for the global market because it was exceptionally tight during that year, which was the worst crisis that we have ever experienced. However, last year, Egypt imported about 12 billion cubic meters. So you have, over the course of 3 years, some sort of 20 BCM difference. And when the market is only 600 billion cubic meters, this is a huge delta, which also somehow contributed to the tightness or to the extended tightness of the global LNG market. Right now, I mean, as you all know, Europe has been progressively facing reduced exports from Russia. I would like actually to highlight the fact that it's not Europe which has reduced its imports from Russia, it's Russia which cut the gas, mostly in 2022. Right now, we have imported about 35 billion cubic meters of Russian gas last year, mostly LNG, about 20 BCM of LNG and 15 BCM of Russian pipeline gas. That compares with more than 150 BCM in 2021. So you can see that the gap was pretty significant. It has been met by two things, essentially. One is reduced gas demand, and the other one is increased LNG imports. And the increase in LNG import has been mostly coming from the United States. So last year, the US was roughly about 25% of EU's gas consumption. This is a pretty big number. And I mean, before, there was no real problem about the EU, I mean, becoming more reliant on US LNG. Actually, the reason why US LNG came to the European market has absolutely nothing to do with Brussels or with Washington. It's very simply a market reaction. The beauty of US LNG is that it's flexible. So when you are an off-taker of US LNG, you take it at the exit of the LNG liquefaction terminal and you send it wherever you want based on the prices. So what happened was really economics 101, high prices in Europe, flexibility of US LNG went to Europe, and some people made substantial profits. But now the situation has changed a little bit following different things. The first was the Thornberry deal, which, EU promised to buy about $750 billion of US energy. This is totally undoable, but it's helping the US to keep pressure on Europe. And of course, recently, the last thing was the threat about Greenland. And this has led European leaders, and you may have seen some comments from Energy Commissioner Jorgensen, rethinking the dependency on US LNG. So it's not going to be easy because, of course, US LNG is not only, well, already 25% of EU's gas consumption, but it's also the source of LNG which is growing the most. So when you are looking at, this additional 300 billion cubic meters, a big chunk of that is actually coming from the US, followed by Qatar, which is going to be the second source. And then maybe in also, that expansion, there is going to be a little bit of refilling of Egyptian LNG export capacity, because we have already mentioned that, the gas from Cyprus and the gas from Israel are probably going to contribute to a higher utilization. Well, I mean, we are pretty much at zero now, but higher utilization of Egypt's underutilized LNG liquefaction capacity, which from an economic point of view makes absolutely sense. Europe now is facing a huge dilemma, which is, what to do with this dependency. And electrification is a big answer. I have written recently a piece on Europe being caught between the petrostates, which are essentially the US in that context, and the electrostate, which is China. And in order to reduce the dependency on gas supplies, well, you need to do one thing, which is electrify and also save energy, but mostly electrify, which means you are going to become more dependent on China, because China controls pretty much everything which is linked to electrification, so solar panels, some windmills, batteries, etc. So this is, a choice that you need to make, but very consciously. This is one of the ideas in order to reduce the dependency on US LNG. But at the same time, I think there is going to be renewed interest from European stakeholders on trying to diversify gas supplies and not to be too reliant on US LNG or LNG in general. I have to say that our relationship with Qatar are not particularly great either. You mentioned North Africa. Well, yes, North Africa, and in particular Algeria, is a great supplier to Europe, mostly to Italy and Spain. However, despite the crisis, these supplies have been actually decreasing over time. So the problem with Algeria in particular is that gas prices are very low and the gas consumption has been growing and growing and growing. So this is actually constraining the export potential. And we don't know to what extent we can really rely on Algeria to continue to supply the southern part of Europe. I mean, it's going to continue, but whether it can be maintained at current export levels, this is a big question mark. So there is going to be definitely to be interest in gas coming from Egypt. I think for the past 15 years, we have been looking at the potential of having a pipeline coming from all the East Med discoveries to Greece. This is probably gone now. It would be very difficult to build a pipeline. It's technically challenging. And also, I mean, having a pipeline, it will not be operational before 2030. You need to have significant commitment from stakeholders, buyers in Europe, and that, given all the uncertainties on future EU gas demand, this is pretty challenging. I'm going to stop there because I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of additional questions in the next part of the discussion. And thank you very much for your attention.
That was great. Thank you, Anso. And the theme that I think will come back in the discussion is the tension point between domestic demand for the gas that's produced in the region and what was potentially an income earner for export. So I'm glad you brought that up in the case of Algeria. Of course, that's also the situation that we've seen more severely in Egypt. And I want to go to Ira next and talk a little bit about sort of the gas investment environment. Anso just mentioned that, a pipeline through the East Med, which has been everybody's dream for a bit, is probably not economically viable. And maybe one of the reasons, and you could explain to us, is that the market for gas is becoming, fluid isn't the right word, right? It's becoming more volatile, right? And so it sort of, and that's a response in some ways to anticipate ups and downs in demand. Europe, one example. But the way that the pricing has happened in longer term versus spot market pricing is changing among suppliers too. So anyway, you can walk us through, Ira, on the kind of the general gas investment landscape. We can get to that question and we can come around it multiple times in terms of Gulf interest, particularly in the East Med, but expansion on gas projects on a global scale at home and abroad. And I know you've commented frequently about Qatar's expansion. And maybe you'll tell us and give us a little color on what that looks like right now.
Okay, thanks, Karen. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
I mean, I think we get to the most important one of all is that, and this literally just happened this month, is that because Egypt is in such a precarious position between being a net importer, a net exporter, and it bounces around, it just announced its largest drilling program ever. And that means that they're going to find more gas. And when they do find more gas, the question of, the Israeli import contract, and whether that goes through or not, or how that's priced, is going to be, really interesting, because Egypt goes through these fits and starts. And as a panelist in the first session mentioned very importantly, the renewables build out in Egypt is going to be very, very significant as well. I mean, Egypt obviously is a very sunny country, and the amount of investment that's going to go into Egyptian renewables is really significant. And why that's significant is because 60% of Egypt's electricity is gas fired, and a lot of the big chunk of that gas is going to come from Israel now, but then is going to eventually, because of this drilling program, assuming that it is successful, will become domestic as well. So you have a situation here where which is common again elsewhere in the world. And Karen, to the point, I think you want me to more broadly talk about is as Anne-Sophie mentioned, we have a huge amount of supply coming into the market, but we're not totally sure where all of the demand is going to come from. Now, when Israel first found Leviathan and Tamar in 2009 and 2010, the idea everyone had was to take that gas to Europe, and as Anne-Sophie said, that kind of has sort of fallen by the wayside. And I mean, I would argue that they never should have tried that in the first place. The European gas market, while at that time you could have argued that it was going to stay stable, certainly since that time has been shrinking in size. And what we're more or less looking at is an exercise in replacing Russian gas, and then since that time, UK gas and Dutch gas with other forms of gas supply. Now, a pipeline could have theoretically been good, but I think sort of the kind of accidents of history have led us to a really kind of interesting, different dynamic here, where instead of this pipeline going through Cyprus, Turkey, and into Greece, the whole hub system is sort of shifted towards Egypt, which actually ends up making a huge amount of sense, because Egypt has this 18 billion cubic meters a year or so of LNG export capacity that's sitting there more or less idle. They occasionally export a cargo, but it's just kind of sitting there idle. And it will be able to take, gas, domestic gas, will be able to take in gas from Israel. And then it creates much more flexibility for this East Med gas. And I think that's really important here, because no longer will you just be locked into Turkey or Greece or some Southern European market, which again isn't really necessarily growing, and also has a lot of competitive gas, coming up against it as well, potentially from Syria, certainly from Central Asia as well. It really creates a much more flexible, way to sort of have this gas enter the market. So I think, that significant change of sort of the hub dream of the Eastern Med being Turkey and Greece, going to the hub dream of the Eastern Med kind of going to Egypt, is, I wouldn't say it's an accident of history, but I think it's a sort of fortunate change for sort of everybody involved. And, the only thing I really worry about is if and when they find gas off the coast of Syria, the same 10 years won't be wasted trying to build yet another pipeline to Europe, because everyone sort of sees an idea that a pipeline to Europe would potentially be the most lucrative option of all, which I don't necessarily believe it would. So I think sort of that sort of rounds out just sort of what's going on in the Eastern Med, as you mentioned, with Qatar, who's about to engage in a very large expansion now, and then Egypt, and then Algeria going through kind of a similar thing that Egypt is going through now, where domestic use is potentially rising to a point that's limiting exports by pipeline and in the form of LNG. You do have this sort of taking care of the domestic market versus taking care of the export market sort of dilemma. And I think this is actually true for Israel as well. And if I were the prime minister of Israel, I would sort of argue towards more sort of hoarding the gas for domestic use. I mean, certainly the Leviathan and Tamar are big fields, and probably more gas will be will be found there. But it's not the North Field in Qatar here or Qatar and Iran. It's significantly smaller than that. And given the rise and certainly the significance of energy security as an issue, and certainly that's always been the case in Israel's case, not just because of recent events, I would tend to think that sort of limiting exports or really looking at exports in a more holistic fashion, where you want to keep your domestic economy growing, you want to be able to build data centers that may or may not be price sensitive to natural gas prices. You want cheap gas in order to grow your economy. Obviously, that's not going to make the likes of Chevron very happy, because they want to sell the gas which for the most amount of money as possible, which is typically at an export price. But I think from a strategic standpoint, I think this is sort of very, very important. Karen, you and I have talked so many times about in the Gulf how the import of renewables, of solar in particular, and batteries is necessarily leading and good and a positive thing for oil and gas exports, because it allows for less oil and gas to be burned domestically and higher returns on domestic on export sales. That issue is slightly different, I would say, for Israel, given the land issues and the land constraint issues that are different than states in the Gulf that maybe have that kind of optionality. So I would think in Israel's position, it's a slightly different scenario going forward. But again, going back to sort of the most important thing is really Egypt's about to start drilling for a lot of gas and oil, hopefully, I guess, from their perspective as well. And each in the other two phases that this happened, the last one was led by Eni, this one will be led by Shell. They found a lot of gas. And this discussion that we're having now about what Egypt should do is going to change a lot over the next 24 to 36 months as I am assuming here, more gas is found and the export-import balance changes over that time.
That's super helpful, Ira. And one point you make to underscore is that really in terms of the export infrastructure, if you've got it, you're at such an advantage, right? Because the time lapse for construction and the investment dollars required make it certainly sits right now in Egypt's advantage, but make it very hard for newcomers to come in and compete and make the pipeline stories much more difficult to be economical. We'll come back again to the North Field rollout and what that might do or not to markets in the next couple of years. But I want to go to Laurie next. Laurie, maybe you could talk us through within the region in terms of electricity demand and what the kind of energy mix across states is looking at, particularly in states that are going through new transitions. So Syria, really electricity poor right now. Lebanon in an ongoing sort of crisis of electricity. So what are new delivery mechanisms? We're seeing the use of the Arab pipeline again. What else might be a conduit or a mechanism to get molecules to countries and their kind of fledgling infrastructure who are really facing electricity poverty?
Yeah, thank you, Karen, and thank you, the Middle East Institute, for having me. Finally, I get an invitation to speak
at
the
we'll have you
Middle East Institute. So, yeah, so I was so jealous when you were setting up this energy program at the Middle East Institute, and I had like brilliant colleagues that were called in to be part of that project. I wasn't called in, but today I'm really happy. I'm really happy to be discussing about this. So basically, I'm happy as well to discuss about Lebanon, Syria. I know that everyone was discussing at the first panel about like exciting developments in Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, or the rest. But I think like there are interesting stuff happening as well, at least more for Syria, less for Lebanon, that hopefully will catch up as well from Lebanese side. But just to say that, okay, so mainly the Eastern Mediterranean. The energy mix, as we all know, is like most of it is like fossil fuel. We're still at the level where we're still relying for the energy, for electricity mainly on fossil fuel. Some countries like my country, Lebanon, still 99% on or less a bit on even diesel, oil, etc., not even natural gas. But to say that we're still very dependent on fossil fuel, and then there is a bit of deployment of renewables, but still very high fossil fuel. On top of that, this new IEA report that came out recently about the Middle East and North Africa and the electricity outlook, if you want, it says that definitely there's increase in demand. It will double in demand, and basically electricity demand and the growth will be big because of cooling and because of desalination and because of the basically people the population is growing. So growth of population, growth, and at the same time cooling and desalination are the ones driving the need for more energy. Where that energy is coming from? So it's like basically everywhere, basically natural gas, renewables, and then we're talking now about nuclear as well. So the Eastern Mediterranean is the place where there will be need for more natural gas and on the renewable side and for nuclear. That's why I guess like the whole story, it's not about all these connectivity project or all about LNG going to Europe or even like connecting the Eastern Mediterranean through physical pipelines, like physically to Europe. It's more about the internal story. It's more about like how the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean are going to be using the gas that is going to come from the region. So basically, we have two main producers of the region, Egypt and Israel. Israel has the capacity, or until recently, we thought that they were fine with the extra capacity they had to be exporting to Jordan mainly now and to Egypt. But again, they're thinking about it. They're thinking about their future. If the growth of demand is going to come, where this demand is going to come from, and they don't want to end up in a situation where they're exporting much of it, and then they have to think about, okay, where should I get the gas that I need for my people? So that means that there is a need for extra gas. Where will that come from? Yes, Ira is saying that there is a lot of investment or enthusiasm from the Egyptian side because they have the infrastructure, they have the LNG infrastructure, all of that, so they have the advantage. But at the same time, we're seeing now new kids on the block, Syria. Everyone is excited about Syria. So we see Chevron coming in, and it's not easy. Everyone knows like Chevron is a big company. Even Energean, if you want, the small company, or like if compared to Chevron, was not very happy to see like Chevron everywhere in the East Med. And the CEO of Energean was saying like, hey guys, we are reliable. We haven't stopped the gas flowing in Israel. But you're not happy when we say that we want to have more blocks in Israel. You go and you give the blocks to other companies because you want big companies. So this is something that maybe the Syrians as well need to think about. Like, yes, it's great to have Chevron, but it comes with a bit of maybe constraints. But we really wish for the Syrians to really be able to go forward with all their plans. So basically today we see Chevron in the Syrian EEZ. So the exclusive economic zone offshore, we don't know exactly when they will start and what sort of work they will start because there are many challenges. Quickly to say that the Syrian EEZ is not very clear, like where it stops, where it ends, where are the limits. So maritime border issues are important. So the maritime delimitation is very important with Lebanon, with Cyprus, with Turkey. In the first panel, everyone talked about like the possibility of having Turkey and Syria talking about EEZ, about their maritime border. Fine. Lebanon, Syria, it's easy. What will Syria do with Cyprus? Will they talk to the Cypriot government? Will they talk to the Turkish Cypriots? And so it is a very political issue because it's not easy, because they need to please the EU. At the same time, they need to please Turkey. So Chevron might be playing that important role of bringing everyone together for if they're not interested in working in Cyprus. In Syria, definitely they are present in Cyprus. They have now signed a deal with Turkey as well. They are present in Israel. So they are like present everywhere in the East Med and in Egypt as well. So they might be an important player to bring like countries together because they want to benefit from their gas that is needed for the region and for the countries. So now let me just talk about the Arab gas pipeline, and then I'll stop there, and I'm sure like later we will have to discuss more. So first to say, We bought the issue of EastMed pipeline. Definitely that project has died now. It's in no one's mind. But we're talking about connecting, like this connectivity project, but it's electricity. So we're improving kind of like, yes, countries produce electricity from green sources, and then they sell it through cables, etc. And then the link is always Cyprus, and from Cyprus to Greece, and then it goes to Europe. So basically, these are like what had been in the mind of people when they talk about connectivity with Europe. But within the region, the Arab gas pipeline, the other star of the month. So basically, the Arab gas pipeline, that is that pipeline that had been in place since 2007 or something, so or 9. It's the pipeline that goes from Egypt to Jordan to Syria, and it was initially planned to go from Syria to Turkey, and then there was a small pipeline as well from Syria to Lebanon. So basically, this has been used for a little while in 2011 to bring gas from Egypt to Lebanon and to Syria, but then it stopped after the revolution, not in Syria, and after the events of Syria, that gas stopped from flowing. So it was for a short period of time that this Cypriot gas, the Egyptian gas was flowing to Lebanon and Syria. Now there are discussions. In practice, the Arab gas pipeline has been put in use. In one case, it was being talked about it like it might come for Lebanon, but until now, until today, Lebanon has not been able to receive gas through the Arab gas pipeline for different reasons. We can discuss it later if people are interested in. But most importantly, today, Syria is getting gas through the Arab gas pipeline. So basically, that's an interesting factor, because technically now gas is flowing from Israel to Jordan through the pipeline, but that is as well going to Syria. So what's happening, basically, Qatar is bringing LNG to Aqaba, and from Aqaba, that LNG is going into the Jordanian system, and there is the swap system with Israel, and then Syria gets gas for its power plants on the southern part of Syria. And as we know, Azeri gas is flowing from Turkey to the power plant in the northern part of Syria. And these are the connectivity projects that we're seeing now until the final piece is built, which is between Homs and Aleppo in Syria, and then the Arab gas pipeline will be fully used then, and then we will see, like, there are MOUs signed between Egypt and Syria, Jordan and Syria, and there are MOUs signed between Lebanon and Cyprus and Egypt. So paperwork is ready, technically almost ready. So we don't know yet when that gas is going to flow, at least to Lebanon, but definitely it is flowing from Aqaba to Syria and to be continued.
That's super helpful, Laurie. And I wish we had a map to show everybody just what this transit looks like. If one of you has one, feel welcome to share your screen. But I think it's helpful for people to understand. And I'll get to Colby in a second, but the challenge is, there's gas coming into the region. Qatar is exporting, as you just said. We've got the Israeli gas going through this pipeline as well, potentially Egyptian gas going within the region. But then the issue is the connectivity in terms of electricity generation, right? And so we've got a very weak national grid systems in many of these economies. But then we also have very poor interconnector systems, right, for the export and sale of electricity from more electricity-rich places. And there's not really the same IOC or International Oil Company incentive to go out and build such things, right? And so this is one of the kind of great infrastructure challenges facing the Levant and the Middle East right now. And Colby, I'll turn to you on this, and I want to hear your perspective from international oil companies and the national oil companies, particularly also from the Gulf, and how they think about kind of meeting this energy demand. And I hadn't prepped you on this, but I'm just curious what you think. when we think about NOCs, they're not just oil companies, right? These are energy giants. And so they're in the oil business, Aramco, ADNOC, they're in the gas business, but they also have national firms that are in the renewables business. And they can be in the business of laying cables, right? And, transmitting all kinds of whether it's energy molecules or electricity as well. So what does that look like as, the kind of frontier investment opportunity, whether it's in the East Med or elsewhere? Where do you see new production happening, and maybe a little color on Gulf new gas production, like Jafurah in Saudi Arabia? Like, how do all these regional producer puzzle pieces fit together?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And it's great to be able to join this conversation, given that we've had, I think, a really great ongoing discussion on East Med gas at MEI for a number of years now. And I don't think it would be controversial to say that it's in a lot of ways probably been one of the more commercially frustrating gas basins in the world. So it's interesting that both NOCs and IOCs continue to kind of to pile into it. But I think in a lot of ways the discussion around the region and how we think about these resources is getting a bit closer to earth. Lori was talking about the idea that the discussion is really needs to be centered around how the countries of the region are going to consume these resources, less so than how they're going to take LNG markets by storm or something, or the East Med gas pipeline, which is I think rightfully been put to rest as a concept by now. I think a couple things have changed in the last let's say 2 years or so, probably a little bit more, that have governed how NOCs look at this and how IOCs do the same thing. They're being driven by some different factors. In the case of NOCs, seeing firms kind of get into the region, they've done so for some different reasons. A couple of years ago, you had Saudi Aramco and ADNOC, of course, from the UAE, start to invest outside of their home countries in ways that they really had not done so before. Now, of course, Saudi Aramco is not present in the East Med, but ADNOC is in a big way with its joint venture with BP in Egypt. And there was talk a couple of years ago of them potentially joining again with BP to go into the Israeli offshore, which ultimately didn't happen. Debatable whether that was more of a commercial issue or a political one, given the timing, probably a combination of both. But there's what I think has happened with NOCs in the Gulf is that they've taken a good hard long look at their own domestic resource base, and decided exactly how it makes sense to think about their own gas resources in the longer term. In the UAE, ADNOC is looking to expand its LNG capacity, which it is moving ahead with, but it's also investing very heavily in gas overseas. The UAE is getting increasingly more reliant on unconventional production in order to support gas output growth. And as a result of that, there I think is very, very smartly so, the view that there's probably more merit in looking overseas to expand your gas business than to rely totally on your domestic resource base to do this. Even more so the case for Saudi Arabia, which is a much larger gas market, and has basically decided that they are not going to pursue LNG exports from Saudi Arabia, which has kind of been a will they won't they for a number of years now. And they've seen that they can get into the business much more easily and probably efficiently as an investor than trying to set up liquefaction capacity at home, given that we're kind of in the early stages of this new LNG supply wave that Anne-Sophie was talking about earlier. What I think has really changed with regard to IOCs in the East Med, granted they never really stopped investing in the East Med. There was always new awards. There's always been drilling activity. There were plenty of takers for the Israeli bid round back in 2023. There have been continued awards in Egypt as well. But it's got less to do with the region itself and more to do with the fact that the global industry itself has turned something of a corner in the past year, and that's partly linked to U.S. policy, not exclusively so. But in many ways, IOCs are, in a large sense, back to being comfortable with the business that they're in, which is oil and gas. There's a lot less concern or emphasis on decarbonization at a lot of the super majors and independents. There's less pressure from the investor side and from the policy side as well. That's not to say that there never will be again, but that is the current state of affairs. And at our annual Energy Intelligence Forum in London, there was a lot of discussion about this and about how exploration is back, and the East Med is certainly a big region for a lot of exploration, and the drilling campaign in Egypt that Ira pointed out is probably the best possible example of that. And critically, as I mentioned, a major thing that hasn't changed is that IOCs do continue to invest in this region. They've done so for the last several years, despite both political and commercial challenges. There have been key U.S. and European majors, specifically Chevron and Eni of Italy, that have really pursued a strategy in the region that has enmeshed them very deeply in the regional gas trade, as we've heard in a lot of the discussion so far. Chevron has a major role in providing Egypt with gas from Israel. It's also got a big footprint in Israel. In addition to Cyprus, Eni is there as well, is looking to use its Zohr infrastructure to begin sending Cypriot gas to Egypt. And you heard certainly a lot of bullishness from Chevron on their Q4 2025 earnings call, specifically centering around the East Med. So there's a lot of this kind of, I think, somewhat greater optimism in the industry around the core business that's certainly supportive of what's taking place in the East Med and what we continue to see. I think what corporate strategy in the region also continues to contend with, and what everyone else has emphasized, so I'm not saying anything new here, is the fact that the only real export route from the region is Egyptian LNG infrastructure. If in fact that is your main interest in being there. I mean, there've been years of talk about the potential for FLNG from Israel or an onshore facility in Cyprus, but that's no closer to reality today than it was a number of years ago. And there's also this component of Egypt's energy strategy that really continues to take a supply side approach to the gas problem that they have, which again everyone else has spoken about quite extensively, and so that's incredibly supportive of much more exploration. And Egypt has also been offering better terms for gas purchases from IOCs that has only made the environment more attractive. And so the way forward, I think, to a certain extent, just lies in dealing with the reality that Egypt is the region's largest market. Its domestic supply is going to remain constrained for the foreseeable future. There have been moves, as some of the other panelists mentioned, to diversify the domestic energy mix, but the same IEA report that Lori alluded to projected that by 2035 natural gas will meet half of the region's electricity demand growth. It's enormous. This is a region that is not looking for less gas by any stretch of the imagination. So renewables will help absorb new demand, yes, but I think there's really a limit as to how much we can expect them to offset that type of growth, if at all. That's where you'll certainly see the state champions of renewables from the Gulf seeing a lot of their opportunities. But the NOCs are, they've developed their expertise in a different business over the years. They don't, for the most part, see any reason to try and make that type of pivot like you saw some of the IOCs try to do over the last couple of years and have largely done U-turns on. So it's kind of that two-pronged approach that has kept the Gulf engaged I think they see the demand there and see that there's a way to get that kind of resource access, get the equity in some of those projects, because again, the demand is clearly there. But they're familiar with it because of their own predicaments as well. I mean, it's maybe I shouldn't call it a predicament, but gas demand and power demand in this part of the world are not going anywhere, whether it's in countries that are resource rich or resource poor. I think it's really, I'll kind of close with this for now. It comes back to Egypt as a center of gravity. That's where a lot of the Gulf investment has gone, not exclusively so. Qatar Energy is, of course, present in Cyprus and Lebanon as well. They were a part of the MOU that was mentioned earlier for Syrian offshore exploration too. So I'd expect that you'll continue to see them showing up in the region, and that others will too. But Egypt will be the center of gravity for the foreseeable future. The domestic production declines kind of ironically free up a lot of its infrastructure to be used for its imports from other parts of the region, whether that's, I mean, it's mostly Cyprus for the time being, but Israel is a part of the mix as well. And that keeps the kind of gas hub ambitions alive in that sense. It may not be the gas hub that Cairo initially set out to be, but it continues in that direction regardless. And there's only going to be a bigger role for those IOCs or NOCs to continue supporting it in the future.
Thank you, Colby. And there's obviously some really interesting political ramifications of that centralization of Egypt as that hub, which we can talk more about too. I would love to ask the panelists just to kind of look forward, like if you could look 10 years from now in this region, what does it look like? Are we going to see a decline in U.S. exports? We've already talking about some plateaus and certainly in U.S. Oil production. Is that also going to happen to U.S. gas, maybe 10, 15 years plus? What does the market start to look like? And some of you were pretty optimistic on Syria, but nobody's really optimistic on this tiny field off, outside of Gaza. So, who might be, a more powerful producer in that sense, or where are we going to see potential changes in the energy mix? I mean, we didn't talk about Jordan. Jordan has more than half of its electricity generation is renewable, right? So, could we see, a push that really changes some of the demand cycle? But I agree with you, Colby, that no matter what happens with renewables build out, it will be balanced and complemented most likely by gas. So anyway, I'm just curious, like any predictions a decade or more ahead? And so can we go back to you?
It's a pretty tough one. I think definitely, I mean, Egypt will be the center of gravity. That is absolutely sure. But maybe with some ups and downs. I mean, that we have seen in the past. I mean, if you look at the past 15 years, Egypt in terms of production has been really cyclical, and we may see that again unless they really finalize to stabilize, the investment situation. I think one of the biggest issues for investors in Egypt has been, the debt, which I understand is quietly being solved, but this has been a big issue. And also, I mean, the prices at which the gas is being sold on the market. We mentioned a lot of renewables. I mean, I was looking at what the IEA is predicting for Egypt, especially in terms of renewable investment. That's not a lot, I mean, for the next 5 years, they are estimating between 6 and 10 gigawatt of additional renewable generation being installed in Egypt, which, I mean, I think Kobe mentioned that, also in the longer report. I mean, it was looking at 2035. I mean, it's marginal, especially when you are looking at the growth in terms of electricity demand. So are they going to solve their addiction to gas? I am not really sure. You mentioned US LNG, which is interesting because we said that Egypt has been importing a lot of LNG over the past year, especially, and actually quite a lot of that gas is coming from the United States, which is interesting. I would have expected Qatar to step in and to help a little bit more. I think this is still on the card, especially since we are going to look at their biggest expansion, which is finally expected to start at the end of this year.
Fascinating. Thank you, and Sophie. Laurie, what's your outlook? 10 years plus.
Okay, 10 years plus. So basically, I would kind of see, yes, this many of the projects taking off because of that growth and need for more energy. But at the same time, like, because we're mentioning Qatar, it's interesting because Qatar is interested in Lebanon as well. And Lebanon is a tiny country with like, what is their electricity need? Peak time is like 3,000 megawatt or something, which is nothing, but still interested to find like markets, as Anne-Sophie always says, like they have all this gas coming in and they want market, tiny or not tiny, but they do want the market. You see that they are around Lebanon looking at potential of investing in their power plants, investing in providing the gas to Lebanon, even though they have like 30% of the exploration rights in Block 8 of Lebanon, but at the same time, they're looking at expanding their presence in Lebanon, playing the same in Syria. So I think that maybe that Chevron, I'm not sure that, I don't think Chevron will let go of the East Med. I don't think the US would want to let go of the East Med. Regardless when they start work or not, but looking at the future and looking at maybe more potential that after President Trump, there will be another administration that is like more Republican, more MAGA. So controlling resources wherever they are in their competition over resources, over control of politics and economy, I think Chevron will be having more of a if you want, control over the resource in the region, Qataris and Americans. So basically, when we talk about the future of gas controlled or LNG controlled by Americans and Qataris, you would see that happening in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So continuing to work on that. So hopefully, basically, how much Egypt will stay the main hub, if you want. I don't know if there will be an interest in turning. Again, it depends how Syria is going in which direction, but having what to do with Syria and how to use all this investment in Syria for political leverage by the Americans is something to think about as well. And maybe it will be that we'll see some Syria, Turkey balancing of Egypt. So basically, that's what I would think of for now.
That's an interesting prediction and outlook. Ira, I mean, this is definitely moving into the energy security conversation, but you know, if you see 10 years ahead, more competition, more NOC actors, you didn't mention like ADNOC spinoff XRG, perhaps also being into this mix in the East Med. But Ira, what are you seeing in the decade from now?
I see the market becoming very bifurcated. I think you're going to have gas demand growth really be strong in countries where there's gas. But if you have to import LNG, I think it's the future forward is a little problematic because of the cost and the price of LNG going forward. Assuming that any country is going to build their power generation sector on LNG imports it's just, I just don't think it's going to happen, with like a few very, very limited cases, and certainly in countries that are much wealthier around the world that's going to happen. I think the combination of renewables plus battery storage at one end and coal at the other end is a very, very bad story for LNG going forward, particularly in the power sector. if we were having this discussion 20 years ago, Karen, like 90% of LNG demand growth would have been going towards power generation. Now it's like a very, very, very small slice going forward. I think LNG certainly has a role in competition with batteries as a harmonization tool for working with renewables, but I see the growth of LNG really slowing, pretty drastically, to a point where, I'm not sure utilization levels of LNG producers around the world are going to be maximized 10 years from now.
So Ira sees a glut. I mean, you basically just described what's happened in Pakistan, which is super interesting, right?
Yeah, I think Pakistan is a model for like what can happen elsewhere. I really do.
A lot of cheap Chinese solar and balanced it with coal. All right, Colby, your quick outlook, 10 years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was someone on the previous panel that talked about when Cyprus first discovered gas and how much closer they are to producing it than they were when that happened. I don't know if it was quite 10 years ago. I think it might have been more. But I think that's kind of, yeah, exactly. So I mean, I think that's kind of a helpful reminder for the pace at which some of these things do move in the East Med. And I think in 10 years there will be a lot of things that look different, but I think they'll be governed by very many similar circumstances to what we're discussing now. I think, given everything that we've seen and the trajectory of a lot of these factors, I think that Egypt still is the center of gravity in a lot of ways. It might be so for different reasons. I think it's possible that it eventually ends up looking more like Turkey in the gas sense, that it becomes kind of a midstream country for a lot of the region. I mean that Egypt now has 5 FSRUs. Let's see how many of them become permanent. I mean, it's kind of positioning itself as, like I said before, it is a gas hub, but it's probably not the hub that it wanted to be. I think some of that question for its domestic mix will depend on whether nuclear gets built out in the next 10 years or so. I think the renewables pipeline is strong. I don't want to downplay it too much. It's going to clearly play a major role, but I think it's just such a massive center of demand growth that it's hard to see the pace at which these things are coming online. Add to that, because when we talk about renewables, everyone likes to talk about the project side of it, but the investment that's required in transmission infrastructure is, it might not be as fun or interesting of a topic, but it's incredibly important as well. And Egypt has been able to get a lot of that investment, but let's see if that continues. I mean, remember, we're also in an era where almost every government around the world is increasingly under fiscal strain. So I think that will be definitely something that is a really key factor in determining how this shakes out going forward. But I think the take home for what we see in 10 years is that the region does become increasingly integrated, both on the gas and the power side. The political end of things always has the potential to disrupt that, but that's something that I would have left to our colleagues on the first panel. So I do think there's more integration. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to find another Zohr, but that integration will be the way that a lot of resources, whether they're from the region or from the outside, end up flowing into the East Med.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. All right, let's go to, we'd be happy to take audience questions. Also online, you can just type it into the Q&A and I'll be able to see it if you're joining us online. Here in the room, if you'd like to ask a question. And there's no dumb questions. They used a lot of jargon, so it's absolutely good to ask for clarification as well. I think we'd welcome it. You've got some real energy nerds on screen. They know a lot and they like to share, so don't be shy. Oh, we've really scared you. Okay. All right, Valentina, come on. I'm sure you can come up with something.
But a non-expert question.
Here's a mic. There you go.
Hi, Valentina Pasquale with AGBI. I've heard repeatedly this morning that Egypt has the only 2 liquefaction facilities in the region. Is there any play to build anything like that anywhere else? I understand it takes forever and it costs a lot. Would that make sense in the cost of what we've been talking about?
Yeah, so maybe one of you could explain what these floating facilities do as well. So give us a little infrastructure explanation. Who wants to do that? Anso or Ira or Laurie, anybody?
Yeah, I can. So, I mean, Egypt has indeed 3 LNG plants. They are onshore. They are currently underutilized, so it's about 18 billion cubic meters per year. Um, there have been plans for Israel, and they have been looking into that different options. It has actually never really moved forward. There were some onshore options which were very rapidly dismissed. Then there were floating options. Then there was potentially a project with Cyprus. It has never moved forward. I don't know whether they are still looking at FLNG. The difference between floating and onshore is that obviously onshore is onshore and floating is in the middle of the sea. So you have a few examples of that which exist in the world. There is one, for example, in Australia. So this is Prelude from Shell. There is one which has just started last year, or actually a few in Senegal and Mauritania, in Congo. So the thing is that they are relatively small in size. I mean, usually you have like 3 million ton, so which is about 4 billion cubic meters. So it's much smaller than the traditional LNG liquefaction plants, which are traditionally something like 5, sometimes 6 million tons, so a little bit bigger. But the beauty is that you can indeed put that in the middle of the ocean, provided that the conditions are right, and you can also actually remove them if for some reason, for example, the reserves are depleted. There is also something else which has been mentioned, which is a floating storage and regasification unit, so FSRU. This is the other way around. This is to import LNG. So again, I mean, we're talking about an LNG cargo which has been retrofitted, which is attached to a jetty, and therefore you can import an LNG. The beauty of the FSRU is that it can be relatively easily and fast also put in a service. This has been the case for Egypt in the past, and it has been also the case in European countries and a lot of other countries. So this is also providing a lot of additional flexibility for countries like Egypt. I mean, Egypt has been importing. They had a lot of FSRUs, then they removed some FSRUs, and then when they needed to import again, the FSRUs came back. Provided that the FSRUs are available, so these are, ships which have been retrofitted, sometimes they are built on spec, you can actually very rapidly become again an LNG importer, which has been the case for Egypt. But as Kobe said, I mean, let's see how long these FSRUs are going to stay in Egypt.
Right. So just so everybody understands, gas comes out of the sea or out of the ground, it's gas. You want to chill it really cold, make it a liquid, and then you can put it on a ship and send it anywhere, right? So the ability to do that at sea, right, can be a huge resource. And we saw this happen a lot in Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because they didn't necessarily have the ability to, transport LNG when it comes into port. Then you've got to put it in a pipeline somehow, right? So this kind of going back and forth from gas to liquid becomes really useful. Yes, sir, please, Ambassador. Wait for the mic, please.
Ted Katouf. I hope I'm not taking you too far north from the Mediterranean, but Norway has an embarrassment of riches offshore. And I say an embarrassment because they pride themselves on their environmental concerns. They're the leading country in the world in per capita EVs per citizen. And yet they have a $2 trillion wealth fund, sovereign wealth fund, largely because of oil and gas that they export. How much can they expand from current production levels if they wish? And how much are they already providing, Germany, other Northern European countries with gas?
And so you probably know the answer, or Ira, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
120 billion cubic meters is the current Norwegian gas production. Pretty much everything is exported by pipeline to Europe or to the United Kingdom. There is a little bit of LNG. We have one LNG facility, which is called Snøhvit, so this is about 6 billion cubic meters. Actually, you're lucky because I had been looking into Norwegian gas production recently. So the Norwegian Production Directorate is estimating that the production is going to decrease from 120 to 107 billion cubic meter by the end of the decade, 2030. And then by 2035, depending on the discoveries and whether they are brought on stream, it could be anywhere between 65 to 90 billion cubic meters. So basically, because of the maturity of the gas field, the production is expected to come down. This is what the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate was seeing. However, I mean, there has been new licensing rounds organized recently because, as they said, because Europe is actually no longer importing or is no longer going to import Russian gas. So, Norway can step in and help the Europeans. A big problem has been also the demand outlook in Europe. I mean, what you need to understand is that in Norway depends almost exclusively on European gas demand. And, the recent messages, or not so recent actually, the messages that they were getting was European gas demand is going to collapse, so we don't really need your gas. So when you are looking at a 10, 15, 20-year horizon and your main customer is telling you, well, actually, I'm not really sure how much gas I need, you are probably not so much willing to invest a lot into new capacity, especially new production capacity. They have everything they need in terms of pipeline. We're not going to see additional pipelines being built to Europe. So I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, you got the expert, she told you. Anybody else? Less technical or? Yes, please go ahead. Here comes a mic for you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kiran Baez. I work with the Atlantic Council. I have an Egypt-specific question. We've spoken a lot about the transition for renewables and the creation of renewable energy and displacing natural gas requirements in Egypt. But mostly that's been within the context of electrical needs. Egypt is also a major manufacturing hub. They are big in textiles and steel and plastics. So within the context of manufacturing, how can we see sort of gas demand, or what do we expect in terms of changes there and technological developments that can off-place or displace gas requirements there?
Great question. Anybody want to jump at that one?
So yeah, I think on two levels. If I just on two levels, you sort of have to look at that. One is it's about a quarter of the gas used in Egypt is used for industry, but it has to be the right price, and that it always comes down to price. When unless the government is willing to subsidize industry, which in a lot of cases it is, particularly when it's the fertilizer industry and to some extent the petrochemical industry. But when when you're using gas as a feedstock, it's about 70 to 80% of the cost is associated with the price of the gas itself. So again, it's so critical when the outlook is between looking at Egypt as a net importer of gas at 3 times the price of what it probably would be if you're using domestic gas, to fire up the same level of industry. It really does boil down to that. I know it sounds a little simplistic, but really that and the government's willingness to subsidize it for security reasons and for economic reasons is something that's really, really central to the discussion.
Yeah, and less the manufacturing, but the agricultural use, as you say, I think is really
yes, for sure.
Egypt. Yeah. All right, I think that was it. Any last takers, questions or online? Oh, please.
So I wanted to ask more about like the geopolitical context in terms of how are companies pricing that into their investment decisions, because obviously we've seen in the past couple of years that there have been all over the region a lot of kind of explosive conflicts with Israel, Palestine, but Syria kind of changing over issues with Turkey and Kurds and Kurdistan and then Iran and all of them.
We haven't even talked about Iran, yeah.
Yeah, literally all of them. So with that, when we think about LNG and natural gas developments, I mean, these are 20-year, 30-year horizons. There's a lot of investment costs, and this kind of it requires a lot of regional cooperation with pipeline and supply. So I'm just wondering how the companies are thinking about that investment in this very uncertain geopolitical context.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't know, any of you might want to engage and maybe include a little bit of a discussion of conflict risk vis-a-vis Iran right now. Could be very useful. We haven't seen targeting of energy infrastructure in the last 2.5 years of war in the region, but that could very quickly change. Maybe, and Sophia, I know you wrote recently about this with Tatiana Mitrova in terms of Iran's pipeline exports and so some of the vulnerabilities there, but maybe you would have something to say, and then the rest of you are most welcome as well.
Yes, maybe I can answer the question on Iran and leave the floor for the others to intervene because I am answering a lot of questions. So indeed, I mean, we have been looking at Iran because Iran is a very large producer. I mean, this is the third largest gas producer in the world, but because of very important domestic gas demand, it's a small exporter of natural gas. And actually, I mean, the exports have been relatively volatile, especially during winter, because it can get relatively cold in Iran, and the residential gas demand is particularly strong. So usually during winter, there are a lot of interruption of pipeline exports, notably to countries like Turkey. They were also exporting to Iraq. These exports have stopped, and I don't think they have resumed. Our idea when we were looking at Iran and knowing that, we are seeing a lot of movements from US naval fleet right now in the region was that what could happen if, there would be a destabilization, an attack from the US Navy, etc. And the first idea was, okay, I mean, if there is a destabilization, this could impact, for example, gas supply and therefore gas exports to neighboring countries, and in particular, Turkey would be particularly impacted. They import about between 7 and 8 billion cubic meters from Turkey, so they would have to replace that gas either with LNG or with Russian pipeline gas. Other countries like Armenia would be also impacted, but what is important is that Iran, there are a lot of swaps are happening between, for example, Turkmenistan going to Turkey or to Azerbaijan. So this is also to take into account. But Iran, I mean, there is Iran, the gas producer, and there is also Iran in terms of location. And we all know that Iran has a great location, which means their ability to potentially organize a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And for the Strait of Hormuz, where you have a lot of LNG, you have a lot of oil which is transiting. And in particular for LNG, I mean, you have pretty much everything which is coming from the UAE and Qatar. That's about 110 billion cubic meters out of 600 billion cubic meters. So if this is interrupted for a few weeks, this would have a huge impact on the gas market. The worst case would be, there is a disruption in the chain of command, and, some people are having a crazy idea, which is to target Qatar and in particular target Ras Laffan. I mean, Ras Laffan is a place where you have all the LNG liquefaction facilities of Qatar. I mean, everything is together. If that were to happen and these facilities would be partially, totally destroyed, that could have a huge impact on the market, depending on how fast we could bring them back to the market. But we can also have a little bit of optimism. I mean, what Iran needs right now is upstream investment, potential investment also in pipelines, helping them to basically stabilize the exports. So, but that would be in a long-term perspective. That will happen if, for example, we have a removal of Western sanctions, which will allow them to get access to better technology so that, for example, they can maintain and potentially increase gas production. There is also a potential scenario where they are actually doing a little bit what Russia is doing right now, which is smuggling the LNG. That would also imply that they would get help from Russia and China. They would finalize the construction of LNG liquefaction facility, but the sanction wouldn't be removed. So we would have, again, a parallel track in terms of LNG exports.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
I don't know whether somebody wants to take the other question.
Yeah, anyone else on the geopolitical risk in gas markets now, and maybe a little forward-looking or scenario-based? What's your worst-case scenario? I think Anso really described what most people are thinking about, which is that nearly 20% exit from the Strait of Hormuz. Oh, please, wait for the mic.
But maybe
Thank
Karen,
you.
just
Nabil Mikhail, I taught political science at George Washington University and the University of Maryland. I have a question. I hope it will not be labeled as stupid. How does AI figure in that equation?
Laurie, did you want to say something first to that scenario planning, and then we'll talk about AI? Thank you.
Yeah, just one thing about like how maybe just to focus on the East Med, not more into the others that Anne Sophie had talked about, but like on the geopolitics and the war, etc., and the impact on the market. So basically, one issue that was very, if you want, that everyone was like looking at, and that it will stay, I guess, in the history of this the conflict since 7 October, is like even at the highest of the crisis between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, the gas continued to flow. And it only stopped when they had to stop, because they were the companies and the Israeli government and the companies decided to stop for a while at the beginning of the war, and then later at the beginning of the war between in Gaza, and then during the 12-day war for a couple of days. So that was force majeure that stopped. But it didn't stop for any political reason. It stopped for a big force majeure issue. So that is something as well to keep in mind when we're thinking about the complexities of the Eastern Mediterranean, not talking about the rest. But that was something. But the other issue is like, yes, because of wars in that, like the ampleur of a war like between Israel and Iran, platforms and the fields could stop. And this is a major problem, not only for the producing country, but the consumer countries as we saw. And that is something as well to be keeping in mind. So it flows, yes, between countries, even at the highest of crisis. But when there is a war and a physical attack or a physical danger, it might stop. And this is something that companies would be looking at, like for future investment in Israel and in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, good point. And just on the question of AI and that outlook, I mean, I think everybody agrees it's good for gas demand. Yeah, and complementary to other energy production, whether it's nuclear or renewables as well. Yeah, I think that's a given. Okay, well, I will close it out there. I am really grateful to these 4 experts. You gave us very good information, really precise, very, very insightful. And thank you all for coming in person, enjoying lunch, visiting MEI. You're most welcome. And those of you who joined online, you're welcome to join us again in person or virtually. We appreciate your support. And everybody have a great afternoon. Thank you.